Yes, we'll rally around the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We'll rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitors, up with the stars.
Welcome, homeschool history scholars, to this unit on the causes of the American Civil War. The American Civil War was a great, but probably unavoidable, tragedy in our history. Great for reasons as tragic as its cause. Great in loss of life. A contest which, as a percentage of the population, would have taken millions of lives today. Great in terms of the methodology of warfare, using the tactics of medieval infantry and cavalry against rifles which could kill at a quarter mile, and cannon which could dismember a dozen soldiers with one round of grape shot. And great in terms of the resources and commitment required from the civilian population to sustain the struggle. For all that, the war was apparently as necessary as it was great. Necessary because both sides had for 40 years tried every strategy of compromise before resorting to the arbitrament of arms. And necessary because it was profoundly a fight over what the nation meant, what its purpose should be. You can't compromise that away. It basically came down to killing everybody on the other side. It had to be, as Abraham Lincoln said, all one thing or all the other. It was a fight to the finish, and a fight to the death. In this unit, you will learn what those two visions of what the nation should be actually were. You will learn the part that slavery played in defining them, and if and how that despised institution might have been consigned to the history books before the war. You will learn what revived and expanded it at its hour of demise, and about the luck of geography that facilitated its newfound prosperity. You will learn about the not-so-simple, multi-tiered and interlocking Southern society which took care to take care of its own, and withdrew into its cultural fortifications when threatened from the outside. The antebellum South, by which we mean the South before the war, was by no means socially monolithic. You will also learn about the varieties of its social composition, who was in which group, including the group of free blacks in the South. Yes, there was such a group, and it had been growing since colonial times. You will learn about the three great slave rebellions in the South, the last of which was over almost 30 years before the war began, and happened, ironically, in the most liberal of the slave states, where a movement for gradual emancipation had been afoot already for decades. So why did it happen there? You will learn how these rebellions, which always seemed to shock and amaze white Southerners, changed and hardened relations between masters and slaves, and even changed the definition of slavery in the South. So much so that President Lincoln could later appeal to the slaves' resulting deep and abiding rage with his Emancipation Proclamation, and he caused so much discontent on the plantations with that proclamation that Southern soldiers had to literally quit the war and go home to keep the peace. It was a strategy that was highly successful. Slaves who escaped anyway were allowed to volunteer for the Union Army, and in the end they fought their own masters in their own country. You will learn about the gathering strength of the abolition movement in the North in the years before the Civil War, and why as many Northerners did not support it as did support it. You will learn about the fracturing forces within that movement, why its most ardent evangelist was almost lynched in Boston, of all places, for refusing to moderate his views, and why, among Northerners in Congress, no consensus could be found concerning how to abolish slavery or what to do with the slaves if slavery were abolished. And you will learn why the so-called Free Soil Party, which appeared in response to this paralysis, actually had nothing to do with freeing the slaves. You will learn why the idea of actually buying a country in Africa and paying the slaves to move there — this was done, by the way, it is the modern country of Liberia — was never taken seriously by the slaves themselves, even though President Lincoln thought it was the best way to rid the country of both slaves and slavery. In the end, the Northern position on slavery was as varying as the Southern position was unyielding, and the South's 4 million chattel slaves were caught in the middle. You'll hear the whole story about how this evolved. You will also learn the 3 reasons why the slavery issue was left on the boil for 50 years in the public consciousness instead of being moved to the front burner, so to speak, where its recipe for either success or failure could be tasted and the dish either put down the historical disposal or spiced up for acceptable public consumption. Americans procrastinated for generations on this issue, and you will learn why they didn't act sooner or more decisively. You will also learn how deeply embedded slavery was in the national and even international economy at the time, not just the economy of the South, and why Northern businessmen had strong financial and commercial incentives to not want to upset it where it already existed. You will learn why President Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator himself, even pledged to leave slavery alone where it already existed if the Southerners would stop their saber rattling about leaving the Union. Looking at this uncertain and prevaricating history of Northern attitudes about slavery, you might almost think that some other issue was the primary cause of the Civil War. And in this you would be more than almost right. And that other issue was the phenomenon of manifest destiny, which had the country in an aggressively upbeat and expansive mood for 50 years before the opening shots were fired at Fort Sumter. You will learn about the many and varied manifestations of manifest destiny's Holy Crusade, which included a very successful war against Mexico and land acquisitions that added to the American Union basically all of the present states west of the Rocky Mountains. And you will learn why, in the end, this hopeful crusade to cover the continent with the American flag did not, and in fact could not, solve the underlying conflicts between the northern and southern states back east. You will learn why the growth and outreach of the expanding American economy overseas into international markets, which seemingly would have provided enough prosperity for everybody, couldn't avert the Civil War either. You will learn the 3 reasons why the fragile territorial peace between the northern and southern states gradually came apart in the decade leading up to the Civil War, and how it was actually dismantled most fatally, and ironically, by that bastion of federalism and union itself, the Supreme Court. And finally, you will learn the 3 ways in which the North-South conflict eventually, and inevitably, became a culture clash, both sides angry, just because, making caricatures of each other, speaking of each other as they would of a foreign enemy who threatened to invade, partisans on each side drawing revolvers in the Congress, literally fighting with sticks and canes on the floor of the Senate, and murdering each other with axes out in the territories. You will learn the 3 reasons why, when push came to shove, the agricultural South actually thought, seriously, it could stand up to the industrial North with its endless reserves of manpower for armies and manufacturing power to make the implements of war, and you will learn why the election of Honest Abe to the White House in 1860, who was a moderate on every issue of conflict between North and South, actually persuaded the Southerners to strike out for independence even before the new president had arrived on the job or taken his oath of office. Looking back on it today, the Civil War has a certain inevitability about it. But it did not seem so then. Men of goodwill tried for decades to avert or avoid it. The most hopeful thing you can learn from a study of the causes of the American Civil War is how to answer the same question today which they could not answer then: how to replace the tragedy and pointlessness of war with a more productive process of conflict resolution. We know a lot more now about how to do that. If you can invest your quest with the same passion for truth and justice that they did, you might succeed where they failed.
The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the stars. Rally around the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.